name's Raul Alvarez, and I'm the Executive Director for CAN, Community Advancement Network. And we're a partnership of 26 government and nonprofit agencies who, focus on addressing community well-being through collaboration, by identifying ways to align efforts and leverage resources, and identifying, again, community needs and challenges that we can address through a cross-sector approach, through collaborative efforts. And this particular forum today, it's part of what we're calling our Expanding Opportunity Forum series. And it's building on the Central Texas Regional Summit that took place in November. I think it was November 4th. It was very low COVID, so we actually had an in-person summit. So I don't think COVID's been that low since then, but we did have 60 people who assembled in person. And we wouldn't try that right now, right, given the circumstances. So, but luckily, again, we do have other forums that have made themselves available, like these video conferencing platforms that we've all been using and getting used to using. But this, the theme for the November summit that CAN hosted was ensuring an equitable economic recovery. And there was really more of a broader look community-wide at what the kind of issues, right, and the kind of approaches, right, that we should consider in ensuring an equitable economic recovery. And it was only a half-day summit, and of course, because of COVID, probably half the people didn't show up who would have normally show up. And we do have a recording. I see a question that popped up on our website, and we'll kind of drop that in the chat. So you can, again, go look at that, the speakers from that summit. And again, we didn't get to, touch on a lot of the issues we wanted to touch on in the depth that we wanted. So we're having an Expanding Opportunity Forum on this topic of communities of color and the post-pandemic economic recovery. And that's what the main focus will be today, but we have other follow-up conversations scheduled for February that I'll discuss or I'll highlight later in the forum. So we're going to get started with, it is a CAN presentation. So we're going to get started with some research and data, right, to get us going and set the stage. So bear with me just a few minutes before we get to our speakers. And let me just make sure I can get the slideshow started. It's always hard sometimes to navigate. Oh, there it goes. Let's see what can hit. Move the screen a little. Let's see. Yeah. Okay.
You're doing wonderfully, Raul.
All right. You know how these menus pop up and then you have to navigate around them. So again, this is our first in a series of Expanding Opportunity Forums. As I mentioned, the theme is sort of some issues specific to communities of color in terms of the economic recovery. And, in this particular conversation also is looking at entrepreneurship, right? And for entrepreneurs of color and some of their experience and some of their issues and the roles that our chambers played. Our speakers, we're very excited that we're highlighting 3 of our CAN partners as speakers today. And those are representatives from the 3 of the chambers of commerce who are part of the CAN board or the CAN network. So we have Fang, who's President and CEO of the Greater Austin Asian Chamber of Commerce, Tam Hawkins, President and CEO of the Greater Austin Black Chamber of Commerce, and Brittney Rodriguez, Interim CEO and COO of the Greater Austin Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And very excited, again, just for them to be part of the CAN network and just the perspective they bring on a lot of the work that we do. And just kind of being in awe of everything that our minority and ethnic chambers do in the community, because they don't just do entrepreneurship and small business stuff. They kind of delve into all sorts of arenas, which we'll talk a little bit about at the end here in terms of during the pandemic, the different kinds of roles that they played and the kind of needs that they tried to meet during the pandemic. But we wanted to share a little bit of some recent publications, right, that have highlighted, the ways minority businesses have been affected, that were published at, late last year, and again, able to document some of the experiences of the minority and minority-owned businesses and minority entrepreneurs. And so a lot of this was for 2021, right? What were the expected challenges? And you see here that, and again, so this is before, right, our supply chain issues that are occurring in the last, 3 to 6 months, but sort of government mandates and restrictions, as well as is one of them, right? Just because of COVID and sort of the restrictions on folks trying to do business, depending on their kind of business. And you see the other large one, which is the largest, was in this survey, was weak demand for products and services during the pandemic. Again, just given the kind of service that they might provide. And then you see again the other supply chain disruptions, limited credit availability, capital, access to capital. And so we get into that a little more, the financial challenges, paying operating expenses, right, when there's shutdowns and other things that they're experiencing, paying debt, paying rent, and again, accessing credit for these businesses. And then what did they do, right? What did they try to do to survive, right? To adapt and to make it through, right, this challenging time. And then of course, downsizing, cutting hours and staff, skipping payments, right? It's almost like what we do with our home budgets, right, or our household budgets, trying to raise money, right, through different sources, grants, donations, etc. Looking at debt or using your own personal funds to keep the operations going. I think I have one more on this particular publication before we kind of ask our first question, but where did they get capital if kind of accessing loans or accessing capital was important? Where were they successful in getting some support with that access to capital? And, see the Paycheck Protection Program was the biggest one, right? And those, again, we'll talk a little bit about just how accessible those were, right, for entrepreneurs of color. But obviously that was a great source of support for some businesses. And then you see, again, support from grants and local governments, foundations, but the bulk of it was their PPP program. And I'll stop there and kind of ask my first question to our illustrious panel. And thank you again for participating. But just kind of giving just a little bit of what we have going on with or what we learned there, right, about sort of the lay of the land, at least of what the experience has been for minority entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs of color. But do the identified challenges that I laid out there resonate with your experience and what you've heard from your members? And I'll start with Fang, see if you would share and then move on to our other panelists.
Morning, Raul. Morning, everyone. Thanks for sharing these data. And it very much echoes to what we have heard from our members and our community here. Our Asian Chamber did a very small-scaled survey back in April 2021. So all these findings, one of the slides that you showed, the expected challenges, almost echo exactly what we heard. For example, the weak demands for the product and service. So declined income is the top reason, top challenge for them. And on top of that, the supply chain disruption, the government mandated restriction was causing troubles and then causing their concerns. Labor shortage has been big issue even now, but back then when we close it, reopen it, when you can't afford to pay, and then when you open it and trying to pay, that was a lot of balance for our businesses to handle. And then the other concern that's not listed here that we heard from our survey was the health concern of their employees, and then their community in general. So that was constantly in the mind of Asian-owned business and Asian community in the survey that we did back in April 2021. And one of the slides you shared in financial challenges, those are the listed, most well-known financial aids. However, not only Asian Americans, but the community of color collectively share this problem that we have less access to the financial help. So McKinsey did a survey on Asian American businesses. And then one data showed that roughly 95% of Black-owned businesses, 91% of Latino-owned businesses, 91% of Pacific Islanders-owned businesses, and 75% of Asian-owned businesses have little chance to obtain the PPP loan because few minority-owned businesses have existing relationship with a mainstream bank or credit union, which is required to be proved. So those are the hidden barriers that affect the community of color more in general. And actions taken by businesses, cut staff, even close the door, late payment, not able to access to the fund. And then a lot of Asian businesses use a lot of personal funds, just like how that the data that you shared in the third slides. I think that's overall, again, very similar to what we have heard from our community and what we have observed and trying to help within our capability. Raul.
I think it is important to, again, with these surveys, it's right. Obviously, you're surveying folks who survived, right, those first 9 months, right? If you're surveying people in 2021, you had to make it through, right, that latter, or not the bulk of 2020, right?
Absolutely.
So you may not get like the perspective of who could and couldn't access the relief out there. So thank you for pointing that out. And I'll go to Tam next to share her perspective, to see again how these what she might add or might echo based on what we've seen so far.
So, Raul, good morning, and thank you for having us on the panel and for this very important discussion. Some of what we saw absolutely mirrored what your findings were. In Central Texas, what we had for the Black business community, 90% of them are solopreneurs. So some of the other factors that might have affected different communities weren't really necessarily what were causing their pain points. At top of mind, and I do absolutely agree with Fang, was access to capital. But that for Black business owners has been a continuous thread in theme. And we just saw the pandemic really exacerbate and highlight the challenges that come as a result of such. And for our business communities, the health matters. So the restrictions on health weren't necessarily the primary issue. Black and brown people were in a disproportionate amount being afflicted with COVID and the results of the health challenges. So for those communities, actually having some restrictions were protecting the primary issue, which was health, because you can't do your business if you don't have your health. And so although restrictions obviously would impact a business in the long term as well. So I don't remember if your slide actually captured this bit of data, but early on in the pandemic in 2020, we were looking at a 41 to 50% fallout ratio for Black businesses, and to have them, a whole generation of Black businesses just totally wiped out and never being able to recover. I think some of the federal policies that we did see in place, although didn't penetrate deeply as we would have liked, were able to help recover and provide some stability and to those businesses and the income providers. Also, if you couple that with a majority of the small business entrepreneurs are women and they're heads of household, and so then you've got this big issue of making certain that we provide stability in ways that we might not have ever thought about. So I think there's bad news that we had to do this during the pandemic. The good news is we had to adjust and make certain that people could, quite frankly, just keep their lights on, and then they could get to the business aspect of such. So I don't think I have much deviation other than that. And I'd love to hear what my other colleague, what their experience was as well.
Yes, please, Brittney, if you want to add on or echo what you're hearing.
Raul, was that for me? I'm so sorry, you cut out a bit on my end.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, just happy to hear from you and your experience and the experience of your members of the Hispanic Chamber.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Raul and Fang and Tam. Always a pleasure to join you in conversation about issues that are so very important and continue to be so relevant. Certainly, I think in seeing the statistics, from what you're reading, it's difficult not to feel a bit defeatist. It's been a very difficult 2 years. And I think oftentimes we are approached with this sense of optimism. But the reality is the effects have been long, wide, and they will be long lasting to so many businesses. I think when we look at the demographic that we serve, we understand that Latino-owned businesses closed at twice the rate of other minority-owned businesses. We know that, much like Tam said, and Fang, these statistics are incredibly reflective of the experience. But when we start delving a bit deeper, we understand that the ramifications of closures and having to lean upon personal finances to keep businesses running have absolutely had implications that we'll have to continue to study for years to come. What we do know is that, at the onset of this pandemic, certainly there have been opportunities for federal assistance, and that there was an encouragement, an ability for so many business owners to access capital in new ways. But what we also know is that from a cultural standpoint, Latinos were only 20% likely to apply for funding of $100,000 plus compared to 50% of Anglo counterparts. And so what we can now see, understanding 2 years into the pandemic, is that this has had long-lasting ramifications to this community. We also know that the Latino demographic has never really stopped. We understand that there were government shutdowns, but what we understand about so many of our business owners and so many of the community members that we serve is that they continued on because of the need for simply financial support to keep everyday life running. As Tam said so eloquently, and Fang suggested as well, it was basically keeping lights on. So at this point, we understand there wasn't the option to stop. So many of these business owners needed to keep working. And as such, we continue to see issues of cost of housing, especially in Austin, really affecting the situation for this demographic in particular, causing longer hours at work, work during non-traditional hours, transportation issues. So the effects are far-reaching, and again, it's a bit of a whirlpool effect, if you will, right? It's as if you've cast a stone in, and the ripple effect continues out further. So we've seen that, but what we also understand is that, unfortunately, specifically for Latino entrepreneurs, based on a McKinsey & Company study, we understand Latino entrepreneurs entrepreneurship for the community is extremely high. However, in terms of sales and profits, profitability is significantly lower than that of our Anglo counterparts. And as such, access to capital and the ability to scale is traditionally and specifically what we've understood has been compromised most.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, that, I mean, the disparate impacts, right, on just the racial and ethnic communities, right, then also has an impact on the business owner, entrepreneurs of color, right, because, you know, a lot of times that's who works for you, right? So again, if you have the disparate impacts on the employees, then that affects the ability, right, of businesses to also, in addition to all the other challenges or barriers that we were talking about. So it's hard to separate the two, and I think we are going to shift a little bit into that. But I did want to share a couple other slides on, you know, what we did learn. It's a different source here, and let me see if I can get the slide to work. Yay! Okay. So there's a different source, but this was more kind of polling entrepreneurs of color, right, to about their experience, and then what kind of support, right, they would need. So it's kind of more into the, well, what did we learn? I think we have learned a great deal about the kind of supports that families need, but also businesses need. So part of our intent with this expanding opportunity series is to, again, you know, keep these issues in the forefront, right? So that we don't forget what the needs are, and the fact that we should do something before we, quote unquote, go back to normal, which I'm not sure that is really gonna happen, at least not the previous normal. So, but again, part of it is how do we keep these issues in the forefront so that we address them and not just move ahead back to, because we all want to move on, right, from what we've been experiencing. But here are some of the challenges, right, that entrepreneurs identified, that, you know, and we've already heard this from our panelists, right, that emergency loans and grants were not sufficient for these businesses, or not accessible. Entrepreneurs of color were more likely to consider closing their businesses, struggling to access economic relief. And some of this had to do with some of the early hurdles, right, you know, and the unique situation of sole proprietors in particular. And again, we already talked about the access to capital. And the same publication also kind of gets into, you know, they ask these same entrepreneurs, well, what could have helped you, right? You know, and of course, equitable procurement, you know, just those economic opportunities for the businesses, more financial support, streamlined application processes, right? You know, we hear that a lot, just about how there may be relief out there, but if, you know, it's too burdensome and the businesses don't have the capacity, right, to actually navigate those systems, and that's a big barrier. And then the streamlining of permitting processes, right? So if you're trying to adapt, right, just given the new conditions and situations, then again, you know, especially small businesses and sole proprietors have very little capacity, right, to be able to navigate, right, these program requirements and systems. So, so this next kind of question, you know, really has to do more with, I think we've talked a little bit about ability to access local and state and national programs. So if you wanted to add anything on that, that'd be great. But we did want to know, well, what did we learn, you know, besides those were just 4 bullet points. I'm sure we learned a lot more than that during the pandemic about how we can help businesses, you know, during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. So is there something you'd like to share about that, right? You know, about that experience and that support that could be useful to your chamber and your members as well. So we'll start with Tam on this question.
I think that the bullet points did encapsulate what really were some of the biggest strong holes for small business, and in particular minority businesses. But I think the biggest lessons that we've gained from that is that we've got to figure out a way to be able to have them, first off, fund it properly in the beginning, right? Because you're more likely to be able to survive an economic hardship if you have the capital that you needed to operate equitably in the first place. The second part to that would be making certain that when we do find ourselves in the challenge, and God forbid that we ever are here again, like I pray that the next generation or 5 never have to see what we had to see. But if we are there and we find ourselves in that unfortunate spot, how do we get the capital to their hands? And how do we look at business as a holistic approach? And it's not this one size model fits all, right? Because as we've all, I think all of our demographics have a fair amount of entrepreneurs that don't have employees, quite frankly. And so if you have a model that is funneling assistance to them that doesn't fit that demographic, you miss a huge pool of people that actually need help and then actually keep this country running. And so, and all of our communities, I think I speak, and if I speak out of turn, please correct me, they were foundational businesses. They were essential. So they didn't have the luxury of being able to say, you know, I'm going to go on a Zoom call. Like it just wasn't an option for them. And then I go back to, you look at the health disparities that some of our communities face, and then they're faced with this external threat of a virus that we can't really manage or control. And then you just compound all of the problems, and financial being just one of those problems, right? And so I think that the bullet points are accurate, but I think we have to continue to drill deeper and be able to go behind what's behind that and what are the long-term implications of such.
Brittney, anything to add just about, again, the learnings and, you know, maybe what you're hearing? Because I'm sure they may be asking you for that assistance, not asking the city and others for the assistance. But again, just anything you'd like to share about, you know, what we've learned and or shouldn't forget. For me, a lot of it is just let's not forget what we've been through, and let's learn and adapt based on, you know, what this knowledge we have, right, about the experience everyone has.
Thank you, Raul. And Tam, I think you're exactly right. We understand that, yes, absolutely, local government took a stance to provide aid to so many businesses. But what we also understand is that based on the statistics, unfortunately, the data simply reflects that for whatever reason, there was still trouble reaching specifically Latino businesses. We understand that at most, if looking at all of the relief efforts, at most 22% of the recipients of any of those sources of aid were Latino. So well under 30% for any source of aid. And specifically, what we also understand is that based on, you know, National Bureau of Economic Research statistics, that 1 in 3 Latino-owned businesses closed within the first few months of the pandemic. So the effects were felt very early. But what we also understand is that only 1 in 5 of the recipients of local governmental aid were Latino. So there is absolutely a disconnect. And to Tam's point, it is incumbent upon us to understand what that disconnect is. What happened there? What are the implications? Are we looking at political implications? You know, social implications? What happened here? Because the aid was there, but for whatever reason, there was a disconnect in business owners either seeking out the funding, assuming that they could, again, dig into their own pockets to make it through, or finding alternative ways to come together and find a way through. You know, and at worst, of course, shuttering with doors closing. So I agree. I think that at this point, we now have enough data under our belts to understand it was there. Absolutely. But was it as accessible? Was it made as accessible? Was it introduced to communities as it could have or should have been? And then from a standpoint culturally, you know, one is then asked very basically, does it come down to communication? Is it a matter of information simply not being provided as accessibly in another language? Should it, you know, needed to have been? So I think these are all notions that are worthy of deep consideration, but the numbers show that although it was there, it had a small impact, and certainly we've got work to do.
Yeah, and I think you know, again, our racial and ethnic chambers get asked to do so much, right? I do think, I think for me, always things that comes to my mind is just, again, because you have access to such a large membership who then has access to employees and clients, right? I mean, again, these are very potentially very effective vehicles, right, to get, you know, whether it's PPE or whether it's help getting access to some of those programs. It's, you know, or just, again, even like, let's say mental health, right? We have a mental health challenge because of everything we've experienced, and y'all have members who have employees who have the same mental health challenges, right? Is there a way to kind of focus in on and again, for me, it's like partner, right? Through partnership and engagement, really try to meet the needs of the community, but at the same time working through this trusted vehicle that is our minority chamber. So thanks for everything you do. And I'll, that's just Raul's 2 cents before I hand it back to Fang so she can, again, share other learnings or other ideas for helping businesses kind of during the pandemic.
Thanks, Raul. And, you know, I can't agree more with both of my peers here. A lot of factors, you know, we don't know what we don't know, right? A lot of those factors are hidden. And then if we don't dig deep, then we can't make it surface to be aware before we treat it. And then if you don't know, or you don't even look into different sectors, different communities, you won't even start that whole process. So for Asian community, for example, there are, you know, 3 hidden factors on top of my mind. Some of it is sharing what my peers has shared. For example, language barrier, right? Brittney mentioned none of the 4 financial relief services offered by the U.S. Small Business Administration provided translation into Asian languages on their website. And only PPP loan offers any level of the Asian translation for the application forms, and for just 7 Asian languages out of the more than 15 most commonly spoken in the Asian household. And in our region, the Central Texas region, we have at least 20 different ethnicities and within Asian community alone. So Asian American have some of the widest variance in corporate success, educational attainment, and income. So this variety, this language barrier, is a huge factor for our community and for community of color. The other factor is the Asian-owned businesses are overrepresented in the sector that has been hit hardest during the COVID. For example, so the Asian population by average nationwide is about 6%. 6% of our population is Asian population, but in the Asian-owned businesses account for 26% in the food and accommodation service industry, accounts for 17% in the retail trade, 13% in healthcare and social assistance, 11 in educational services. So 1 out of there's a 1 Asian-owned business for every 6 Asian adults, compared to the U.S. average 1 for every 8.4 adults. So Asians are more represented in the business sector, and in especially those sectors that hit the hardest. That is, you know, you have to have enough data to even decipher this and have this knowledge. And in one of the slides, Rahul, that you shared with us, you know, tracking the social, tracking the pandemic's unequal impact, Asian data was not even there. It's not even available. And that's a very tangible barrier for our community. Oftentimes, you know, so for us, without data, without visibility, we can't even start to talk about what should be the solution, no matter it's Ken or us or anyone else. Lastly, but definitely not the least, is the Asian hate sentiment that has been sadly arising through along with the COVID, right? We still remember those derogatory terms, China virus, Wuhan virus, whatever that's affected to us. So on top of the COVID burden that we carry, just like everyone else, we have to carry that anti-Asian, sentiment. And when it translates to business, they could get damaged, vandalized, and difficulty or boycott, all this additional economic burden that our community could be facing. And these are just three top concerns, that our community and the community of color faces, but not necessarily being reflected enough in a lot of mainstream data. So, Raul.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was looking for sources, right, it was hard to find ones that weren't just specific to Latinos or African Americans, and that also included Asians. And in that, right, and I know we encountered that with our local data as well, right, and that is a very important point. And one of the slides I didn't show, but was supposed to, was sort of the snapshot of sort of the economic relief program managed by the city, right, and during the pandemic, right, and that I think to Brittney's point, right, I think only 15 or 16%, right, of the awards went to Hispanic businesses, and so I think and also to get to Fang's point about data is, right, that can help guide you in terms of the response, an appropriate response and more effective delivery of services. But you can't forget about this stuff. You know what I mean? You gotta okay, the data is there, but you have to use the data. I think that data on the economic relief program for the city also showed that, out of the 2,500 applications, only about 20 were in languages other than English, right? And I think half were Spanish and half were in Asian languages, but that's not a very big percentage, right? So again, just kind of reiterating some of the points our panelists made, and that, and again, some of that stuff, it might look like pretty charts, but it does tell you, it does give you insights into how we may behave differently going forward, not just, again, as a community, right, who cares about equity and inclusion. So kind of a follow-up is, and again, I know we were supposed to have a couple of council members on. I think Council Member Tovo was on there, and then Council Member Fuentes was hoping to also participate. But have you seen local government really kind of respond differently? I mean, obviously a lot of it, just to provide that economic relief, obviously, but are there conversations about how we could operate differently that we are having or should be having, right? Just to move forward this kind of idea of having equity in the actual economic recovery as we think about everything that's needed for that to happen. So I don't know if Brittney, if you have any kind of thoughts on that, if you have anything to share with folks at the city or county, kind of our local governments who want to help, right? But it's like, how do we, what are some of those things that they could help? Because again, and I always talk about the unique role the ethnic chambers play, right? Because you have to worry about surviving as an organization, first of all, supporting your members, right? And we'll get to this in a little bit, and supporting the community, right? Because the chambers are go-to sort of institutions in so many different instances. But really, if there's anything, again, Brittney and the rest of our panelists, starting with Brittney, is just about the kind of support, right, that you could see making a huge impact for your organization and your members.
Absolutely. Thank you, Raul. I think the situation in Austin is especially difficult because it's compounded by so many other variables. We are one of the few cities that actually saw an increase in the cost of housing, in property taxes during the pandemic. We actually saw an increase of approximately $100,000 for a home in the city of Austin. So while we understand there was significant financial constraint that was caused as a result of the pandemic, what we also understand is it was compounded by folks simply needing a home. What we also understand is we see a great migration of communities of color, I should say, leaving traditionally what has been home base, East Austin, if you will, as new businesses come in, as new organizations come in. And certainly proud we are and glad we are for the arrival of amazing corporations like Tesla, Samsung, the who's who arriving in the city. We also understand there are long-lasting effects of placement of these organizations and where they choose to land. So I think a notion that we continue to focus on heavily is simply access to housing, being cognizant of transportation issues that are affecting communities of color in particular. The average commute for our demographic is approximately an hour longer than it used to be. And we understand that the projections show it stands to be even longer in the coming years with the projected rates of growth that we look at. So I think cognizance of simply the changing demographics and the changing landscape of our city in terms of affordability are compounding every issue that is already difficult. And so I think what we find as we look at this is it can't be broken down to a finite issue. Is funding going to be an issue? Is access to capital an issue? Absolutely. Profitability and revenue, those will always be issues. But I think what makes Austin unique is again, the changing timeline and variables that we see every day. 189 new folks to town every day. That number is, we're a case study. The city of Austin is a case study. And I think to Fang's point, we can look at the statistics, but they're going to continue to change. And we have to continue to identify what makes our situation so very different. As of mid-2021, Latinos now account for the largest majority in the state. And so with this in mind, we also understand the tremendous value that we bring to the table in terms of GDP alone. So it is incumbent upon us to recognize again, that communities of color are very much responsible for the ongoing recovery simply because of their contributions economically to the state of Texas and nationally as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Fang, anything to add? Just on, again, what would help you and your members coming out of this, right? And there's a lot to share, I'm sure, but anything you'd like to highlight?
Yes, Raul. The effort should be all together from all encompassing. So, but if Council Member Tovo and Fuentes is here, or other public elected officials here, I have some specific suggestions and recommendations for the public and the social sectors to work on. One is absolutely the data, right? Statistics. We showed how important it is. If you don't gather the data and don't gather the disaggregated data, especially within the Asian subgroups, you don't have a full understanding of what kind of program and aids that, what kind of policy should set up to target these problems, right? For example, within Asian group, Burmese community might have need more assistance in, technology, food access, health access, where Indian, Asia, Chinese community might need a different, type of help. So all this visibility needs to be there to be able to rely on for the public sectors and private sectors to begin with. So who can work on that to put together? Our organization, we try to work with UT, some academia or some consultant company, but for us, we have so many balls to juggle, and then we have so little funding, so many issues to treat. So how, in the pragmatic resource way, that can we put together some data to, first of all? So that's number one suggestion. And then with the data, with the visibility, we can design and designated employees to track and oversee this minority inclusion as a recovery initiative are developed. So and then we can keep a track and have a baseline and monitor the progress. And then, later on we can see this is success. This is how much we helped with the inequality, equality. And then, for the Asian language barrier, that's the third one, right? So organizations and public sectors can offer some verbal written language assistance for all of its service and resources, especially in Asian languages. I know we're very almost demanding because we have such a variety of language issues. Oftentimes, we are asked to translate to some, but Chamber's role, and then, again, our capability, our capacity doesn't allow us to go that deep. And then we're just feeling very helpless most of time. Lastly, for Asian community specifically, organizations, public sectors, probably take concrete steps to combat with the anti-Asian dialogue or anti-Asian slurs, but something looks beyond just a reporting portal, because we know that we have a reporting portal on the City of Austin's webpage, starting from the beginning of the anti-Asian hate sentiment of this cycle. However, the result last time I checked was 0. So how realistic that is, right? If nobody's reporting, why is it not reporting? I mentioned to some friends and community that a case of my mom who lives in Waco area. So if she migrated to US in her 50s, not speaking English, barely speaking English. So if she goes to a grocery store, encounter this kind of anti-Asian sentiment, and then, does she understand it enough? Does she understand it enough to report to, and does she have the language capability to communicate clearly, to understand the process enough to get to the, report to the right people? Does she have the courage, given the legacy fear about the government authority that's shared by a lot of Asian countries? They don't feel authority is there to help, right? Are they able to understand that process? And then finally, with all this help and then courage that they gather, they need to be able to access the technology, savvy enough to access to that portal to report this. And after that, after the report, is there a follow-up? If not, Asian community would say, well, this is useless, right? We have this Asian merchant group that we often experience the vandalism, and then even if they report it to the police, the chances of being solved is little to none. There must be, people are making effort, but if the result is not there, this whole process needs to be aware, to be examined, and to be reevaluated, and maybe designed a more practical way so that it's really capturing and helping the minority groups and a community of color. So those are the 4 very demanding recommendations from us, from me, for the public sectors.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those. And I think language access has come up in so many different arenas, like just in terms of access to healthcare, right? Access to emergency services when we have a winter storm. So I do think, again, that's, we kind of look for these kind of approaches or priorities that can have impacts, right, in a number of issues, number of arenas. So, so thank you for sharing all that. That was very, very enlightening. So anything you'd like to add, Tam, on that question of, what would help you and your members the most, either right now or going forward, or that you don't want us to forget about?
Absolutely. I thought I understood the question earlier was about the city and what kind of worked well, right? And so I'll start there. I think there are a lot of things that we can be proud of that Austin really did well, and we're fortunate enough to have a council and staff and private sector that galvanized behind a lot, and we're able to get funds and programs directly into people's hands. And that, again, as I speak, I don't just specifically speak about business owners, because for us, it's a totality. I go back to a lot of my membership, they're the only employee. So we have to look at them as, okay, they're the breadwinner for their entire family. So when you take care of the rest, the external, the extra, then you take care of that entrepreneur so they can go on to do their business. I think the opportunities for regional planning are abound. I think we learned that we really have to join together and join forces to look at what's going on. This is particularly important to my demographic, because there's a lot of Black flight from Austin because of, as Brittney so eloquently stated, the affordability factor. So a huge swath of my membership doesn't even live in the city. And so in the past, city leadership was loath for us to explore that, I call it the elephant in the room, right? Because we had to, and rightfully so, by law, they're dictated to focus on the city, but we have to look at it from a bigger perspective, because the regions and the areas that are actually beating us that's what they're doing. And I know Austin is a great place to live and we're wonderful, but I think we have to learn lessons from others. And then as my colleague Fang talked about, I am reminded of the great Shirley Franklin when she was faced with some really pressing issues in her city. And we look at the data, but we look at the story behind the data. And I think Brittney also talked about that. So we always have to really figure out what's going on. Like, this data is saying this, why is it saying that? And where is the opportunity to explore the growth model? And then for Black businesses, the biggest challenge, which again, I know that all three of us could echo, is affordability. Where are they going to literally put their shingle? And if we make it as such where that is not an opportunity, we're going to see more flight, and it may not just be in the surrounding areas, right? They will eventually move on to other cities that can accommodate them. So I think that for us, finding the opportunity to be able to afford to actually do business here and making certain that all the gains and the inroads that we've made over the last couple of decades aren't eradicated.
Yeah, that's a great point about affordability. And I think Kathy in the chat, mentioned the childcare part of that. I know all of us, have a kind of a staggering impact on our personal budgets, the housing part, but also the childcare part, right? And then the access to those kind of services that are just basic to people being able to run their businesses, or for their employees to be able to remain employed, right, and stay in their jobs. And so I do again appreciate you raising those, and I think again, as a couple of you alluded to, the data again kind of speaks to maybe where we might put some of our attention, and continuing kind of to look at the data, in terms of how do we better serve African American, not just businesses, but the community, and Asian American businesses and the Asian American community. Same thing with the Latinx community. So, but also, again, there's different avenues, right, to reach folks, right? So it can be through the chambers, or it can be through better relationships with language communities, as Fang was alluding to, and it's true for the Hispanic community. And just place-based work, right? If we know there's a concentration of need, right, and the data shows where the need is, right? Again, these are again ways to use the data for the purposes of targeting what are limited resources. And before kind of opening up to a few more questions, via chat, but I don't know if it's just curiosity for me, or just want to understand, like, just kind of again, just to what extent, because I know I saw so many folks doing, relief efforts to the community, not just in your typical role, right, as chambers, and the kind of supports you provide to entrepreneurs or to your members. And I know you provide other services besides, kind of small business support as well. But, so some of it is, kind of obviously your membership may have been affected right during the pandemic. Sort of how are you doing now, kind of just health-wise, but also how much was it that you were asked to work on, let's say, food access or health access, getting people the PPE or getting people appointments or vaccine opportunities, food, right? Technology assistance, right? So anything you'd like to share on that? I think I have Fang listed first. I'm trying to not pick on the same person every time. Anything you'd like to share just about that? Again, just kind of looking at community needs holistically, and anything you'd like to share about either what challenges or what successes, right, you all had.
I feel like I've already shared a lot of this hidden, and then so I answered this question too soon. But those factors stays sadly, right? So the language issue is still barrier, lack of the data for us to rely on, for our community to rely on, especially for the policymakers from the public or private sectors to rely on, is non-existing. This anti-Asian hate sentiment needs to be calmed, and that winter storm didn't help, right? So that's a lot on top of the COVID. So that's a lot to everyone. So mental stability issue, childcare, that's shared, not way beyond just our Asian community and community as a whole. I don't have additional, and I feel like I'm hopeful, but it's been a lot for our community and for everyone. So I feel that.
All right, Tam, anything to add on that? Kind of note.
Yeah, I think, and my colleagues are being a bit shy, so I'll brag on them a little bit. We found ourselves and to your point, I think you've hinted at this earlier, Raul, in just a near impossible situation. I think we were all terrified that we'd have to lay off staff. Would our chambers that have been around for decades survive, and the importance of our chambers to our respective business communities. And we were, up in the middle of the night, as many other people were, no doubt. But that crown was heavy for us. It was very heavy. So we found ourselves, I think the Hispanic Chamber took lead on this project, and we were giving diapers to mothers in need. And so we were, our chamber was providing access to mental health providers. We curated this huge list of mental health care providers that looked like them and that could understand what their challenges were. Who knew that Austin had so many Black mental health care providers? And so, and the Asian Chamber was able to turn on a dime and make certain that their restaurateurs were able to keep their doors open. So we all respectively, we found ourselves in spaces that none of us wanted to be in. We ended up being, therapists, figuring out healthcare provisions, we were everything. So I think you've said that, we've been stretched thin. We're at the end, hopefully, of a long journey where we are so passionate about this city and the importance of our chambers that we do it all over again in a heartbeat in many different ways. So yes, we became things that we didn't know that we would have to. We walked entrepreneurs through filling out their PPP loans. We called our bankers that we were friends with and said, "You've got to get this family some money." We did it all. And those are the stories that don't often get told, but certainly it's what some of the work that we do.
Thank you, Tam. Brittney, anything to share on that theme?
Absolutely. So eloquently relayed by both Tam and Fang. I think they've encapsulated it beautifully. And I think I have to smile with Fang's admission that yes, certainly we proceed with a great deal of optimism, but the reality is it's been a very difficult couple of years. And to Tam's point, we've been forced to wear a lot of hats, and a lot of hats in ways in which I think that we've been a guide for so long, for so many community members, that it feels commonplace. It's easy, it's second nature for us. But I think what's happened this go round is we've also been cast into a situation that nobody quite understands. No one knows the right answer, and we're still very much in it. That's the reality is, we can talk about recovery all day long, but the reality is, 1 in 3 Latinos still report having trouble paying bills, concerns about access to food, coupled with 3 in 4 Latinos suggesting that they're concerned that children have fallen behind during the pandemic academically. So the reality is we're still very much in it. But I think the social component is probably the overarching issue that we hear about day in and day out. Are folks worried about revenue? Are they worried about survivability and solvency? Undoubtedly. What we often hear most is, I miss you so much. People miss seeing each other. They miss being together. And I think the reality is we hold to the tenet at the chamber locally that we're simply better together. And the reality is, while we are, of course, recovering, we're in this together, we're in it. I'm so grateful to work as closely as I do with my minority chamber counterparts. But the reality is people miss each other. We miss the opportunity to come together. And the notion certainly exists, yes, that there are language barriers, inabilities to connect. And that comes down to a logistical standpoint. What is it? We understand that 13% of Latinos are less likely than their Anglo counterparts to even have a computer. 15% are less likely than Anglo counterparts to even have home broadband. So the reality is there's a touch point culturally. It's word of mouth. It's a trust in going to the same folks that you always have. But if those same folks have been removed from the system simply because they couldn't survive the pandemic, we're now forced to look at things in different ways. And so I think the reality of this situation is absolutely. Does it feel like we're moving in the right direction? It does. Are we getting better at it? We are. And to Tam's point, we'll keep wearing those hats that we have to make sure that we're getting to the solution. But the reality is we're still here. We're all still here. And I've never been more available to my members. I know I speak for Fang and Tam as well when I assert that I'm sure it's the same for them. I'm fielding phone calls long after 7 p.m. in the evening from folks who just need help. And so I think to that end, it's pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's doing what we need to do to just get through, but we're making it and we will. And I think we can all see the progress. We're better than we were, and that's hopeful for what's to come. But there's a lot of hope, I think, ahead of us, and we're absolutely in it to win it. Next to those who are committed to making the change as well.
Well, excellent. Thank you so. Go ahead. Yes.
Can I add a little more? I have to.
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
We're just speaking our hearts together. And 3 of us, minority chambers work very closely together. We talk to each other more than we talk to some of, our members and, staff. So that's how closely we're. And then we share the, common concerns, and then we share the solutions. And if we think of a, campaign, we collaborate each other. And then that's going to be the continued, the route that we're going to be on. So we collectively, we're not just the Asian, Latino, or Black community. We can't afford that. It's a minority community. It's a community at large in Austin, and we're just part of it. And wearing multiple hats was, extremely true for all of us and for the community of color, right? Because we are receiving some city funding. So, we heard some voices that were saying, should a city or should this private money help with the chamber? We hear some of the voices. The reality is we can't afford to just be that economic development organization in our community. We don't have many alternatives. So winter storm hit, artist hits, right? So the PPE, the masks we secured early on during the pandemic in Asian community, all those are not strictly the economic development issue, but we had to get in because we don't have a better alternative or any alternative. So we are having this business development hat and a big goal and big responsibility, and we can't ignore the social responsibility we have. So that's why we're together. That's why we are going to need any resources we have, financial or human support, and then, the societal supports from everyone. And we're going to continue work together nicely.
I just want to add they're married, because for us, the social component, we can't ignore it. And, you know, and I think about the civil rights movement, they were married. And so they are. And back to your point that when you consider eradicating that, you do your entire, what does that, your city look like when that happens? And so, and I don't think any of us want to find that out.
Yeah.
And Raul, if I could just briefly mention as well, just very quickly, because I think it's relevant for each of us across our various networks. Oftentimes we enjoy the privilege of receiving information, and as do our city counterparts. You know, we receive information swiftly. We get information oftentimes before others do. And so what I'll say is, I think the power of connection cannot be undermined in any way. So I think for anyone who's here today, you know, should you hear, because of course, you know, I hear it at almost every street corner, someone suggesting, I need this help, I can't quite find a way, I don't know how to access it. Simply connecting them to us collectively, we have so much information to share with the community. And what I'll say is that although we understand there's an issue with access to, you know, electronics, equipment, laptops, internet, what we know is so much of our demographic is present within social media. And by re-engaging so many of our connections via social media, we've provided assistance we haven't been able to in some time. So I'll suggest for anyone that's watching, you please do share our information across social media. If we can provide any information, share our information for folks to reach out to us. It's what we're here for. We're here to provide relief, and we're better together. We work collectively as a unit, and I am so grateful for my fellow panelists who I do lean on every day. So you know, the reality is, please, you know, follow us on social, follow our newsletters, find us on the web. You know, we're here to help. And if the answer isn't there, call us. We're more than happy to take your call and chat with you for as long as we need to. We'll get to a solution.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so inspiring. Thank you all for lifting us up during these difficult times. And I do think, again, for me, one of the learnings during these, not just the pandemic, but even the winter storm, right, is just the mutual aid aspect, you know, and a lot of times like groups like our minority and ethnic chambers step up in those ways, right? But it's all like on top of everything else versus, again, how do we, through relationships and partnerships, not lean on people doing this as volunteers or out of the goodness of their heart, but as a vital infrastructure, right, that we have in our community. And so that's why I think your organizations and the other, you know, chambers we couldn't include, right, are jewels for our community, right? And that we need to support you and make sure that you're not having to downsize, but upsize so you can do more of what you're doing. And just based on what we've learned, right, we do need that approach, right, and that understanding in the community. So so I did want to just share one last slide. It's not going to be data. It's just going to be upcoming forums. We're going to ask for, you know, if you want to ask a question, now's the time to ask it on chat. I'm just going to share one slide real quick about our upcoming forums, because I think our panelists alluded to it a little bit into some of the issues or even some of the comments. Let me see, well, there you see it there. I'm not going to worry about making it a slideshow, but we have our next conversation is kind of building a family-friendly workplace, you know, as a strategy, right, for business success, you know, because it's hard to retain and recruit employees, right, if you can't help you know, provide the healthcare and the child care and, you know, an environment where, you know, folks can decide to come back or stay in the workplace. So that one, that particular conversation is on February 9th. And then we have women in the post-pandemic economic recovery, which again, our panelists alluded to as well, but it will kind of also delve into the specific needs of women of color, right? And, you know, with the economic recovery. So we will dive into some of those issues that our panelists alluded to. But yeah, really just at this point, just want to say if you have any, if there are any questions or any ideas for kind of how to follow. I think there was probably 10 follow-up conversations that I identified during the discussion, but I'll just kind of let our panelists kind of any final words, if you have any final words before we end, and I'll keep checking the chat to make sure we don't miss any questions. But any final words from our panelists? Very much appreciate this conversation.
I think I'll just add that I think we're all fortunate enough to be in partnership with CAN, and to be able to have this dialogue and to be able to penetrate and impact our community in a greater way. I think oftentimes we all work together, and the LGBT chamber as well works with us, and we get in our bubbles and we work together, but we also have some amazing partners that help us with this journey and along the way. So I think that I believe Brittney said it, and Brittney, if you didn't, I'm going to attribute it to you anyway, that we work well together, and that we've got a lot of hurdles, but I'm really optimistic. I think that although the pandemic happened, we get to learn some really good lessons that we don't have to kind of go back to normal. Because for me, I don't know what this big rush is to go back to normal. Like, we get to be able to reinvent some things and figure out some things that just frankly weren't working well. And so, and I wish there was more focus there, and I'm happy to work with my colleagues to implement some profound impacting change.
Brittney or Fang, any final words or advice? Or
I agree with Tam. I mean, at my core, I'm nothing more than an eternal optimist. And so I think that that's what's made this last 2 years so exceptionally difficult. Because, each time you make it, to the next chapter, there seems to be another challenge, a new novel challenge with which we're presented. But I think, to Tam's point, it's an all around reset. I think we can approach things better. We're becoming more efficient, we're faster, we're connecting. We've always been good at connecting. It's our gift. It's what we do. But in this sense, I'll say that the relationships that we've established, the partnerships, with which we're working these days, have never been more formidable, even with one another. I'll say that we've never worked as closely as we are, and the time is right for that. I think there's now a greater willingness to listen. I know I'm a lot quieter than I used to be. Certainly just hearing sometimes is the best way to understand exactly what the issue is that you can't possibly fathom. So in this sense, I'm with Tam. I absolutely agree. This is a new opportunity, and one that generationally across the board can be enjoyed by pretty much everyone, to arrive better, to be better, to do better, and to do more. And so I'm hopeful. We're very much in it, but there's a lot of improvement that we can make, and efficiencies can be improved as well. So there is good to come. There's lots of good to come.
When I joined CAN, I was amazed how diverse our partners here, from every sector. And for me, it was a great learning, and very confirmed, and then feel like assured that we have the right people in every partner, every sector. So when we provide this kind of platform, people take it back to their own domain area, and they chew on it, and they can come up with some creative idea, and then we share and we collaborate. This is such a wonderful platform, and thanks for having us here, Raul. And I wanted to plug a little bit more on what we are thinking of doing in Asian Chamber later this year, if COVID allows, right? Because I have such a belief in platforms like this, where gather all kinds of people from different background here. Asian Chamber is thinking of the similar platform to launch the first Texas Asian Economic Summit. Hopefully, the situation allows us to do it later this year. And that will be also another platform to connect any companies and individuals and public sectors to who has any kind of Asian tie, to have a place to start to think post-COVID, to prepare for the post-COVID economic rebound, right? So we need to prepare for that before that, to nurture it for it to come, and we're ready for that. So again, appreciate this platform, appreciate your invitation for us to share what we're doing, what concerns of our communities and our members with everyone. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you all very much for the work that you do and for taking time out to be part of this conversation. I don't use, you know, the CAN network, right, is a very diverse one, as Fang mentioned, and there's a lot of potential for these kind of robust conversations, but you have to create the space, and really appreciate you all making time to, you know, help us understand this part of the conversation, because it's, again, interconnected to a lot of the other conversations we'll be having going forward. And so, so I'll probably be following up with y'all just about, you know, again, the follow-up topics, at least, again, you know, who should we bring into this conversation? And again, feel free to all the participants, you know, attendees, email us, or if you have ideas for follow-up conversations, especially if you want to help organize them, right? But it's very exciting for me, again, very early in stages of trying to identify CAN's role, right, in ensuring an equitable economic recovery. But we have a lot of great ideas to really kind of look at and assess and discuss with the larger board, right? And so muchísimas gracias. Thank you all very much for this time together, and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise, and for your just profound commitment to our community and making it better. So y'all be safe out there, and we'll be sending out all the materials, you know, as a follow-up, right, to this conversation. So keep an eye out for that. So thanks again, and y'all have a great day.